Welcome to Dental Business RX. Practice success in 30 minutes or less.
Thank you for calling ABC Dental.
The name of this episode is The 7 Biggest Mistakes When Buying a Dental Practice. And look, not going to lie, I could have just as easily called this the 27 or 37 biggest mistakes when buying a practice, because I've seen my fair share of these, although I would definitely shatter the 30-minute motto, which I've done before anyway, with the for the podcast. In any event, I whittled it down to the mistakes that I see most frequently, with the hope that if you're in the process of buying a practice, whether it's your first location or your third location, that we can help you avoid some of these and come out the better for it. My name is Jeff Bloomberg, and I'm your host, and I'm just going to plunge right in, and I'll start with mistake number one. So mistake number one is buying a practice when you have no clue what you're actually looking for. One of the recommendations I make, again, because, your circumstances may differ. If you're buying a second, third, fourth location and you've got a main office, that's a whole other thing. If you're an associate or you don't have a practice, maybe you sold a practice and you're moving to a new area, and you're looking at buying an office, you want a clear idea of what it is that you're trying to buy. How big of a practice do you want to buy? How much revenue should it be doing? Do you want it to have expansion potential? Where do you want this practice to be? You can always swap out things like equipment, but if you've got a rental in a condo unit that has no ability to expand and it's got 3 chairs and you eventually want 4 or 5, that could potentially be a bit of a problem. And then one thing that people don't take a look at is, do you have the skill set to scale the practice? Because if you have the skill set to scale, it actually opens a lot more doors. You may be looking for a place that's doing $700 or $800 a year, but you're going to pay a premium for that. You might be able to find a place doing $200 or $300 a year. I know that's what I would do. I'm not a dentist, but if I were advising one of my clients, I'd buy a smaller place with a lot of upside. There's a lot of practices that are for sale or that will be for sale over the next, 5-10 years that don't fit the DSO model. So you could buy something small. It's like buying low and selling high. If you eventually want to sell it or build it, you could actually take something small and build it up really quick. We have clients do this all the time. But I would get a vision for what it is that you want to buy. You should have a clear idea of this before you actually start looking. Otherwise, you don't know, because you're going to call a practice broker and they're going to give you a list of all the listings they have in their area. And half of them, 70% of them might not fit what you want at all. So if you are very clear with your broker from the beginning, look, this is the type of place I'm looking for, then they have a better idea of what to give you to look at. And, I'm not getting into this because I've seen people make mistakes with brokers, but when you're working with a broker, make sure that you work with as many brokers as you can, only because practice brokers, when you sell a house in the United States, it goes on the MLS, right? I think it's, multiple listing service, I think is what it stands for. But any house that's being listed is on the MLS. So any realtor can see that house. Any real estate agent can see it. Brokers don't work the same way. They rep the practices that they are selling. So in theory, there could be the exact place that you're looking for down the street from you, or it could be exactly where you want it, and you wouldn't know it's for sale because the broker you're working with isn't listing that practice. So the best idea is to have communication with all the brokers in your area so that if something comes up, you find out about it. So that's the first mistake. No clear-cut vision of what am I trying to buy. The second biggest mistake is selecting a practice that's a bad fit for your situation, for you specifically. It may be a perfectly fine practice, but doesn't fit what you're looking for. And look, when you're in the initial selection process, okay, so you like this office and you like this office. Well, now you're going to go look at it and decide whether you want to sign a letter of intent or whatever. You haven't bought it yet, but you're sinking time into it. You might end up buying it. So you want to make sure that it at least checks the boxes to some degree in your vision. And I wouldn't stretch my reality too far. For example, let's take some simple stuff. Like, let's say you need in your vision, you want at least 4 chairs, or 5 chairs with the ability to expand to 6, but you need at least 4. And this place has 3, and it's in a place where you can't expand it outside of where it is. You can't knock into the suite next door and you can't build an addition onto the place. Well, even though it might be nice, it doesn't fit what you want. And if you might think, well, I'll just buy it and move. Well, moving a dental practice isn't like moving anything really, because then you've got plumbing and build out and whatever. It's expensive. So you want to make sure that this is a good fit for you. It might be too much practice, with not enough upside. It might be too far away. The doc may do a ton of implants and you don't place them at all. It could be anything. It's just a bad fit for your situation. Or let's say you're buying a second or third office and you've got a main office that's your primary practice. That's where you're chairside most of the time. And you want to buy a satellite location and you're looking at a place that does $2 million a year. Not only are you competing with DSOs now who are going to overpay for this place, but how are you going to keep both these places going at the same time? What if you lose the associates in this place? There's a couple different things you want to look at. You want to make sure that the situation fits yours. And like I've said in other episodes, and I'll have another one coming out this year because I do sort of an update on the state of the industry, but there are a lot of practices for sale and there's just going to be more. The reasons behind this I'll get into later in a couple months. You'll see the episode air. But don't think that you have to buy this one specifically, all right? Mistake number 3, and this is usually the biggest one, is incomplete due diligence. Now, if you're listening in the car, you probably heard due diligence and you shut the podcast off, in which case you're not hearing me say this. But this is probably the biggest error I see when somebody buys a practice. So let's say you found a place. It checks your boxes, at least the ones that are important to you. There's no deal breakers. Well, now we got to find out what the real deal is with this place. And we do this for any other major purchase that we make. If you buy a house, you call inspectors out. You have your due diligence period, and the home inspector comes out and whatever. And I'm a bit thorough on these, just because I've had experiences before with home purchases. So I don't just use the home inspector during my due diligence period. I pay an HVAC guy to come out, an electrician to come out, a roofer. If there's stucco on the house or a pool, I have experts look at those, because home inspectors are good, but they're not, they're doing all what they're doing in a day. They're not going to be able to see anything and everything going on there. And I've had instances where I've had a home inspector come out and miss a ton of stuff with the electrical. It's no fault on the home inspector. It's just that person has a lot to look at that day. So when you buy a practice, it's not just the money, but the time. You're now on the hook for this place. So you want to make sure you know exactly what this is, warts and all, that you're buying. And like I said, this is normally messed up. I mean, to that end, what we use with our clients, we have 12 due diligence checklists that they run through before they actually buy the place, including driving around the neighborhood around the practice and seeing what it is they're buying. And these checklists are anywhere from analyzing what plans they're taking, what's going on with the staff, what's with the equipment, financial analysis, clinical evaluation. There's 12 checklists. There's a ton, just because we want to make sure that anything and everything that we know what's going on. Is it going to be perfect? No, but that's why you're doing the checklist. And how bad can this get? I had a client, now this was years ago, bought a practice, and I don't know if this would even be possible to do these days, but it allegedly had a certain amount of charts, right? And so it was a second location. It was maybe 15 miles from his first office, which was a good enough distance so they weren't going to compete for business. And he buys the place and he noticed that the schedule is just starting to empty out and he can't figure out what's going on. Well, it turns out that half the names in the software were random names, just to show how long ago this was, that the prior owner had entered from the white pages. This was just a listing of everybody's phone number for those of you who don't know what this is. There was the yellow pages for business, the white pages for individuals. They just entered a bunch of pages names from the white pages. These were not patients. These were just people they put in the system. But he never actually looked at the system. So there's things you're going to want to look at. What is the overhead of the practice? Don't just take what you get from the broker, because there's costs that you're not factoring in. There's also going to be costs you're going to have that the current owner does not, including debt. If you're pre-approved for a loan of some kind, find out what the payments are going to be, because now you have to factor that in. You also, I'm assuming, have to make a living and pay your bills at home. If you keep the revenues about where they are, will you be able to do that? I mean, this is why, I don't know if they still have this, but B of A Practice Solutions, which is, a company that works with dentists to provide, it's owned by Bank of America, used to have a whole section of their business called the Heartbeat Department or something like this. And this was for practitioners that bought a practice and weren't doing well enough or were getting into trouble potentially paying their loan payment. And that may not be the only purpose of the department, but I remember that would be what would happen with people that were having trouble. They'd go over to the heartbeat section, right? But these are things I'm going to want to find out. What's the deal with the staff? Am I going to have staff problems from the get-go? What's going on with the marketing? I go and look at the Google page, and the rating is 2.8. I could go on, right? There's a couple of specialized points I'm going to go over, but the problem is once you buy the place, and again, I'm not an attorney, so don't take this as absolutes here, but unless there's fraud, if you buy the place and you just hate it 1 or 2 months later, unless there was fraud in the transaction, you're most likely stuck with it, right? So again, not legal advice, but I would want to make sure I knew exactly what I was buying, right? What is this? Mistake number 4 is overpaying for the practice. And, I have certain rules I follow in this, just like with due diligence. I look at, okay, what's the projected revenue? And I don't want my rent to be over a certain percentage of projected revenue. And again, I know I'm kind of going into the last point again here before I get into overpaying. But these are things, like with overpaying, this is something that, I'm not going to move on because there's a reason why the practice should cost what it costs. It's the same thing with if I look at the overhead and the rent's $8,000 a month and the place is doing $40,000, the rent's 20%. Right? That's a problem for me. That's too much. And I could sit there and think, well, oh gosh, if I go in there and I just blow the place up and it does, $100,000 a month, well, now we're under 10%. But there's a lot of ifs associated with that. I want to make sure that this thing is not going to be a problem. I don't want to face problems I don't necessarily have to face from the get-go. So what do I mean by overpaying? So if you look at and I know the valuation procedures have been bent a little bit over the last few years, but if you went back 15, 20 years, the valuation, or 30 years, the valuation methodology for purchasing a dental practice was very simple. You paid roughly 70% of last year's collections. That was it. So if the place did $800,000, you paid $560,000. If it had old equipment, you might pay $500. If it had brand new stuff, you might pay $600. You were paying roughly 70% of last year's collections. Now, since private equity and DSOs have entered the space, you see all kinds of crazy valuations for these bigger offices. And it's based off of a multiple of EBITDA, which I'm not going to get into an explanation of EBITDA earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. Let's just call it profit for simplicity's sake. So you'll see a person has a bigger practice. It's doing, let's say, $4 or $5 million a year. And their EBITDA, essentially their profit, it's not the exact same thing, but let's just, for argument's sake, let's just use that number. Let's say their profit is $1.5 million. So they produce 500 or collect 500 and their profit's 1.5, or EBITDA is 1.5. And there's a whole, whatever, I'm going to move away from. I start to say I'm not going to explain it, then start explaining it. Never mind. So it's 1.5. So what the DSO will do is come in and say, okay, we'll give you a 5 times multiple of EBITDA. So they're going to give you $7.5 million for this practice that collected $5 million last year. I mean, that's great. And we've had a number of clients sell that way because, in a lot of cases, if you have a practice that's doing $5 million, $6 million, $8 million, $10 million, number one, there's no private buyer market for that. Who's going to come up with $10 million or $8 million or $7 million to buy an office? They just don't have it, the individual dentist. So that's why corporations got involved. And again, like I said, I've seen our clients go through this when they get ready to sell. But then also, if there was a private buyer, 70% valuation of a $5 million practice would be $3.5 million. So this DSO is offering them 7.5. Look, I've said this before. If someone came up and offered me twice what my car was worth, I would, of course, talk to them a little bit. Like, you can get one like this at the dealer, right? Yes, but I really want yours. Okay, is there something in my car that I'm not aware of? Like, is there gold under the panels or something? No. Okay. Well, I think it's ridiculous. You could go buy a new one. Well, I really want this one. I'm willing to pay. Fine. Okay. Give me the money. It's fine. Well, we'll sign over the deed. It's I'm not going to fault someone for selling for that. But ultimately, I'm just going to say it, these places are overvalued. So how is this bled into the private market? Well, you've seen it a couple different ways. You've seen people try to do, you've probably heard of this term before, roll-ups. So you get 10 doctors who get together and they go, okay, we're going to say we're all one big series of practices, like we're our own little mini DSOs so we can increase our valuation. When the space was new, when private equity was first jumping into dental practice purchases, that worked. And then eventually private equity, hedge funds and whatnot got smart and went, yeah, these aren't DSOs. So they stopped doing those. Or You'll see valuations of small practices, 800,000 a year at 100%, 120%, or they want a multiple of EBITDA. I don't, look, here's my thing on this. I'm not going to pay that. And I would advise that you don't either, especially if this is your first practice or even if it's your second or third and you have one main office. Otherwise, you're overpaying for the practice. Pay 70% of last year's collections. And the truth is, the only time you're going to run into where you're competing with a DSO is if you're trying to buy a practice that's doing over $1.5 million a year, which, again, if this is your first practice or even second, third, or fourth location, I would not recommend that you buy that. I think that that's a really bad idea, especially if you're getting into multiple offices. You should absolutely know how to scale, in which case you should be buying something you could scale because that's going to work out for you better financially in the long run. If it's your first practice, why would you want to do that? You're going to give yourself, ulcers if you buy someplace where your loan payment is just catastrophically huge. Buy something that checks your boxes, it has a lot of upside, and stick within this 70% valuation math. The place collected $600 last year, good, it's worth $420. Now, can you bend on this? Sure. And I have, or I've had advised clients to. They're buying a practice and the doctor had an idea. I want $500 for this office. When you do the math, it's really worth $480 or $485. Should they pay the extra $15,000 to $20,000? Yeah, fine, pay it. What's the big deal, right? It's not the end of the world. And the bank was fine on paying it, so it wasn't a huge problem because the whole valuation math has been messed up. Similarly, when you go to close, like let's say you're paying, this place collected $500 last year, and you're supposed to pay $350 for this place. And then you look at, like I would want P&Ls up until closing, because let's say this takes a few months, and let's say I look at the trailing 12 months. So let's say at the end of 25, it did $500,000, right? I'm going to pay $350. And then I look at and I'm closing in May. I look at last May to this May, it's really only collected like $450. I may want to adjust the price for me now, because this place is producing less than it was originally producing, and therefore I'm technically overpaying. But do not overpay. That's one of the bigger mistakes that I make, because once you overpay, especially if you're using debt, now your payments are up, etc., and the revenues aren't there to make it an easy transition. Which brings me to point number 5. Another big mistake is weak transition plan with the current owner. Now, this really depends on what and how you're buying. If you're buying a place where the owner is planning on bailing as soon as humanly possible, they're going to stick around for a month or two and then they're moving out of state. That's not bad. You send out your letters ahead of time. The doc introduces you to a bunch of the patients. You figured out which staff you're keeping and you're not, and then the doc is gone and you're on your own. Fine. If the doc's going to be around for whatever reason, maybe they own your building, or maybe they're going to be working for you as an associate. Well, that's where if you don't have a clear idea of how this is going to work, it starts to become a problem. So you have the staff going to the old doc, asking them questions and ignoring you, but you're the owner, right? Or you find with this doctor still sticking around, you have a massive difference in clinical philosophy. And this is going to be an issue because, you're walking in and talking to patients and you're both disagreeing on, what should be done about this. And the problem is, who's the patient most likely to listen to? The person who's been their doctor for the last 25 years. And I've seen that cause a lot of problems. So you want to make sure if they are going to be sticking around for any length of time and they're going to be your associate, turn it into an associate job interview at that point, so to speak. And I have podcasts on this, and we do courses here at MGE on this. But one thing I would want to make sure with any associate you bring on is you have an agreement on clinical philosophy. If there's a massive disagreement, this person's going to be sticking around, you're asking for trouble. You're asking for trouble. So this would be a problem for me. The other thing is if you don't really run the numbers and then you work out what you're paying this, former owner as an associate and you're overpaying them, I've seen that happen before too, and it becomes, again, an issue. Now, like I said, I've seen examples that have really worked out well too. Probably one of the best ones I ever saw was a fellow who bought a practice. This was back in 2006, 7. And at the time, he paid over $700 for that practice. So think with inflation, this is 20 years ago. This is a lot of money he put into this office. Very gifted clinician, was doing a lot of implants back then. And he bought the office, and the fellow he bought the office from was looking to retire, but he wanted to stick around for a while and associate. Once we worked out how that would work, the prior owner doc would do what he'd been doing, and then he would introduce the new doc to all the patients, and the new doc would do the more advanced procedures. It worked amazing. And it turned out both his daughters both worked in the practice too. The owner's daughter, the former owner's daughters, as an associate and as an office manager, and it went great. Everybody had a great time. It went really, really well. Was very successful because it was all clearly laid out. as they were doing it. So I've seen this work out well, obviously, but I normally, when I see it work out bad, is when there's basic disagreements between you and the person you bought from, and they don't leave. So you want to make sure whatever the transition plan is, it's well worked out. And if the person is going to be sticking around, treat it like you would treat hiring an associate. You want to make sure that there's some agreement there. Mistake number 6 is signing up for every insurance plan under the sun, moon, and stars. This is for whatever reason, and I don't know why. This seems to be a natural inclination, especially when people are buying their first practice. So you're looking at this office, it's collecting a certain amount of money, it's running a certain way, it has whatever plans it has, because it already probably has some. And then you close on the practice, and then you sign up for everything. I wouldn't do that. The idea is eventually you want to get these things out of there, so why would you already add to it? And it's already producing or collecting whatever it's producing or collecting with the plans that are in there. I would leave it status quo for now before you made major decisions on this. And, look, if you've been listening for a while, I've talked about insurance plans quite a bit, so I'm not going to hijack this episode for that. But, yeah, that's something I absolutely wouldn't do. Which brings us to mistake number 7. Which is walking in with no operational plan. So you've done all your due diligence right, and maybe you've even figured out all the little stuff you're supposed to do when you close, but you don't really have a plan, a rock-solid idea of what you're going to be doing on day 1 to get the place going. That's critical because you want to make sure that this place takes off. You don't want to spend the first month figuring out what's going on. That was what due diligence was for. And that's just going to add to your stress as you're burning your working capital. So to help with this, I'm going to include a handout for free, and it's called The First Week, Laying the Foundation for Success, and it comes with an action checklist. Now, to give you an idea of where this is from, we do something called the DSO Seminar. We do a seminar on this. It's actually a seminar with both me and Sabri. It's a week long. I think we're doing it again in December. I'll put a link to it on the episode webpage if you have questions. But the idea behind this was because there's so many, with the demographics in dentistry, of younger doctors not buying practices as a whole. Overall, it's gone down quite drastically over the last 20 years. And you have about 40% of the practices in the United States are owned by doctors who are 60 and over, right? So you're going to see a lot of practices for sale if you haven't already over the next little bit. So we have clients buying additional locations, right, to make them into, practices that are private. They're not corporate offices. They're actually treating it like they would treat their own main office. So it's a 600-page book that goes with the seminar, which I guess you could use to, as a doorstop. Anyway, but it's a 600-page book, and in there we have, all of our action checklists or whatever. This comes from that. So it's written with the idea that you might be buying a second office, but it's just as applicable if you're buying a first one. So I would definitely check that out, but keep that in mind as you download it, because this is something, especially if you've just recently bought, there's probably things in there you have not done yet that would be smart in order to get the place going. So those are the 7 main things. Now, there was a lot of things that I left on the table here that I didn't discuss, and, improper financing or not financing correctly, not having a very detailed list of things you have to get ready for. You start day 1 and you don't have a credit card machine, things like this. One that didn't make the list, but I've seen it enough, so this is like a bonus mistake, if there's such a thing. But I've seen it happen enough to where it's worth mentioning, which is ignoring or playing into diagnosis problems from the previous owner. All right? So let me explain what I mean by this. So, again, I'm commenting as a non-doctor. I'm just commenting based on the discussions I've had with clients when they were newer and they bought a practice. So you've just bought this office from some doctor who is retiring, and then you start looking at the patients, and you see there's a lot of work to be done. And in some cases, people just tell them the work they need done, and some people balk because the old doctor never said that, and some people just do it. But I've seen people adopt this mindset, new buyers adopt the mindset that they don't want to freak the patients out, right? So they don't tell the patient that they need something when they in fact do, because the prior doctor was putting things on watch or not diagnosing treatment because they were sort of on their way out. So here's the only thing. This is your practice now. All right, this is your practice. This is especially problematic if the older doctor is sticking around for a while, as an associate or whatever. If they're in the practice, this is an even bigger problem. That's why the clinical philosophy thing is really important. So this is now your office. So you have to be true to yourself. So I would work out a way to explain without the other doctor looking bad, without softening your stance, but to explain this in such a way to patients where it doesn't make the person you bought from look bad, but still allows you to explain to the patients what they need. And I wouldn't even bring it up if I didn't have to. If you went in there and you diagnosed treatment X, Y, and Z, and the patient's like, fine, cool. But if you diagnose treatment X, Y, and Z, and they go, well, the prior doctor never said this was wrong, and I was just here 4 months ago. Well, you're going to need a way to respond to that so that it doesn't create waves or friction or upset or doesn't make you feel like you're making the old doc look bad. I say old not necessarily as an age thing, but the prior doctor is a better way of saying it. Prior doctor looking bad. But what you don't want to do is just go along with it and don't even diagnose it because you don't want to. You should not be compromising your integrity because you don't want to make waves. You have to tell patients what they need. It's the same thing that happens when somebody gets a new patient and they have a large treatment plan and they're afraid to tell them what they need because they're afraid they're going to get upset. I mean, what is that all about? You may as well tell the person what they need. Look, some people are going to be upset. That's how life works. Not everybody's going to agree with you 100%, but the majority of people will not be upset, and you should be true to yourself. So there you have it. Those are the 7 main main mistakes, the one bonus mistake. And like I said, there's tons of things I could have covered, but these are the most frequently made ones that I see. And look, buying a practice, a new office, whether it's your first, your third, can be a bit overwhelming, especially because there's just a lot going on, things that you don't think about till you realize that you don't have it. Like, for example, a credit card machine, or you're used to working with patient financing, and then you go to send a patient for financing and realize that you don't have a contract with patient financing, silly things like that. And to that end, if this is something that you would like help with, if you're in the market for a practice or you're looking, you can always call us here at MGE. You can email me directly at jeffb@mgeonline.com, or you can fill out, I'll put a link on the episode webpage for a consultation. If you want to get a consultation on this, we're happy to do it. It's free. Otherwise, folks, I hope this helps. I have that link to that first week action checklist. If you want to check that out, that's free. I also have the link to the consultation. If you want to know more about MGE, you can find us online at mgeonline.com or call us at 800-640-1140. Folks, have a great week, and we'll see you the next episode.